And we're going to begin with Benjamin Pickett, who is associate professor. Uh-oh, did I do that? Sorry. Spoiler alert. Benjamin Pickett, who is an associate professor of music at Cornell University and the author of Experimentalism Otherwise, The New York Avant-Garde and Its Limits, published in 2011. He also recently completed a magnificent and epic second book on the British rock band Henry Cow. His co-authored article, Deadness, won the 2011 Outstanding Article Award from the Association for Theater and Higher Education. Marcy Kwan is assistant professor in art and art history at Stanford University, where she specializes in the art and culture of the US. Her research and teaching interests include the intersections of fine art and vernacular practice, cultural exchange between Asia and the Americas, and issues of race and objecthood. Her first book project, Enchantments, The Art of Joseph Cornell, is under advanced contract with Princeton University Press. I just read that when I made this bio today. I'm so excited about that. Congratulations, Marcy. And an article on Isamu Noguchi and Japanese internment is forthcoming. And our final respondent will be Stephanie Saputo, an assistant professor in art practice here at Berkeley, and an influential artist who often invites viewers to directly participate as producers or distributors. She's the recipient of numerous awards, including a 2014 Guggenheim Fellowship and a 2009 Joe Mitchell Award. Upcoming exhibitions include New Photography, Being at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, Public Knowledge at SF MoMA, and the 2018 Renwick Invitational at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And it is Stephanie Saputo who is on the cover of this weekend's New York Times Magazine, which is extremely exciting. That's right. So please join me, and then after that we'll have a fashion show, and I'll introduce that when the time comes. So please join me in welcoming him.
My preparation for this event, it occurs to me in retrospect, unfolded in an almost perfect narrative arc, I think. I enthusiastically accepted Julia's invitation because, for obvious reasons, I want to be involved in whatever she's doing. And then about 2 weeks ago, I sat down to do the work and thought, good God, what have I done? And then I pushed through that problem and then came to realize in an even deeper way the kind of serious questions around this issue that I've only barely begun to tease out. So I'm really grateful to Julia for inviting me and letting me go through that weird process, and to Lauren for making it easy and smooth. Thanks, Lauren. And to all of you for sharing your research with me. So thanks. It's really nice to be here. As terms or ideal types, Kenner and Liebhaber are expert and amateur. They arise in music theoretical discourse in the second half of the 1700s. And C.P.E. Bach titled a set of keyboard pieces published in 1779 for Kenner and Liebhaber. He wanted the music to appeal to Liebhaber, who naively enjoy with no understanding of why, and to Kenner, who possess knowledge of models or structures and can measure individual pieces against them. For the Swiss critic Johann Georg Sulzer, Kenner sat between Liebhaber and a third term, Künstler, or artist, who not only possesses knowledge of models, but can implement and revise those models in practice. So Kenner and Liebhaber are fairly well-known topics for my colleagues in common practice era European art music. For me, they're more like deep cuts. I had to go all the way back to my doctoral exams to summon some grasp on that knowledge. This talk will continually return to such matters of training and accreditation. For Emanuel Bach, amateur and expert referred to types of listeners and the training they could be expected to have. I'll be more interested in Künstler in this talk. So I think, unlike Gail, this is a talk about producers and not about consumers. But in the vernacular register, that's been a big part of my recent research. I think the gap between listener consumers and artist producers seems smaller than it would be in the fine art context. There's a kind of fast circulation between reception, participation, and production. That will become clearer in the first part of my paper, which draws on research for my recent book on the British rock band Henry Cow. In the second part, I'll turn to some more recent work on the composer and sound artist Marina Rosenfeld. The years of Henry Cow's existence, 1968 to 1978, roughly correspond with the emergence of what I've come to call the vernacular avant-garde. I use this term to refer to the massive heterogeneous body of work that sits uneasily somewhere between the market, the state, and the academy, even as it is continually entwined in all of them. These musics usually feel strange in a concert hall and get practiced instead in more improvised spaces like clubs, lofts, churches, and community centers. This avant-garde employs a range of techniques and discourses in its various historical moments, but is irreducible to any single hypostatized conception of radicalism. What I mean is that these discourses of avant-gardism might draw on histories of institutional critique, or functional transformation, or Benjaminian kind of sensory disruption. There are a variety of different discourses at play, and I'm not interested in sorting out which one is the real avant-garde. In other words, I think artists working outside of the institutionalized fine arts in the sound field develop specific versions of avant-gardism and do so in a self-conscious manner. My sense is that this historical formation couldn't happen before the 1960s for a couple of reasons. The first is the stabilization of the long-playing vinyl record as a format. The specific mode of listening to LPs, that is, a pile of them next to the turntable or traded with friends, had new effects on musical production. Combined with the post-war economic boom and the particularly rapid expansion of the recording industry, lower production costs meant that more kinds of music made it onto musicians' turntables in the 1960s, where the standardization of the format encouraged a kind of equalizing effect, one LP after another. On one list of borrowed LPs that Henry Cow founder Tim Hodgkinson kept in the early 1970s, there appeared Olivier Messiaen's Chronochromie, Luciano Berio's Visage, Ornette Coleman's Free Jazz, None Such as Golden Rain, Balinese Gamelan compilation, and The Who's Tommy. What do these have in common? What could they have in common? The important question for a certain kind of rock listener seemed to be, how can I do that? Such questions seem particularly characteristic of LP listening. In addition to the long-playing record, I think the crucial development in music was the widespread emergence of a popular music aesthetics in the post-war period, beginning first with jazz criticism in the 1940s and reaching an apogee of sorts in rock discourse in the 1960s. Henry Cow intervened in a world where journalists, musicians, and eventually scholars would make assiduous distinctions between scenes and artists based on judgments of taste. And it was not unheard of for artists working in the popular domain to remark critically on the work of fancy composers as if critiquing another colleague. Tangerine Dream's Chris Franke, for example, weighed in on the composer Karl-Heinz Stockhausen's work in 1975. I have to say, electronic music before 1970 was really very primitive. There were just a few generators around, and you had to do a million tape cuts to get a primitive musical result. People like Stockhausen and the French studio people did it, and the music was really horrible. The British press is filled with this kind of commentary beginning in 68, 69 through the 70s of these kind of musicians weighing in on their colleagues, the work of their colleagues. Pop music aesthetics did much more than invert or blur the line between high and low culture, which is that kind of like ironclad way of approaching high and low that we inherit from postmodernism. I think it might be time to move past that. Instead, I think these aesthetics provided the grounds for a thorough fracturing of those two positions, not merely an inversion. And a new positions or a new intricate system of orders and relations and dialectical tensions among them. Finally, in addition to the LP and pop aesthetics, a new kind of attraction to abstract or pure sound was hastened by the increasing accessibilities of recording equipment and transistor-based live electronics. Even if this new crowd was unfamiliar with the Cagean dictum to let sounds be themselves, or the jazz musician's goal of developing one's own sound on the instrument, This privileging of sonic materialism over music's theoretical structures of pitch space or meter would make an important meeting point for the converging traditions of the late 1960s, and would furthermore contribute to the diminishment of the importance of the notated score. Never totally eliminated, but diminished in importance. All of these conditions defined the world into which that glum bunch, Henry Cow, grew. Of the 10 people who cycled through the group, none possessed the accreditation or training that had customarily enabled passage into advanced work in music, by which I mean seminar-based score study or composition lessons. The closest might have been the bassoonist Lindsay Cooper, who earned a very prestigious scholarship to the Royal Academy of Music, even if she eventually fled that institution in desperation for the more open environs of rock. Georgina Bourne, too, enjoyed a promising childhood and adolescent career in the junior department of the Royal College of Music until she, like Cooper, chose another path by age 18. John Greaves joined his father's dance orchestra in the Welsh Black Country when he was 11 years old. That was his education. Pop superfan Chris Cutler declined attending university and learned about modernism the same way he learned about psychedelia, through his stereo. Dagmar Krause was self-taught and didn't read music. Even the Cows who attended Cambridge University, Greaves along with Tim Hodgkinson and Fred Frith, they were there to study other subjects, not music. They were there to read English or anthropology or something like that. Henry Cow's first performance, a wild free improvisation by Hodgkinson and Frith in May '68, bore the title Hiroshima, probably a reference to the noisy, scraping violin sounds that Frith had cribbed from Krzysztof Penderecki's Threnody for the Victims of Hiroshima.
I was buying contemporary music records randomly because there would be these compilations of contemporary music series put out by cut-price labels, believe it or not.
I see.
So there would be a label with Cage, Berio, Moderna, something or other, and then there would be electronic music with Nimaroglu and blah, 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 and then there was one which had the Penderecki design.
Okay.
And these were costing like 10 shillings. I mean, I was just curious, you know.
Let me give you one more extended example that I hope will solidify the importance of that turn to practice in the 1960s and away from the score. This guy, Anthony Moore, joined Henry Cow for just a few months in 1975, but I want to concentrate on his earlier projects and how he came to his musical style. He dropped out of art school after a few months and was scoring experimental films by the time he was 20 years old. Tape recorders were his fascination.
Suddenly I found myself with like 3, 4 tape machines, and that possibility of dubbing and looping and running simultaneous loops and working and cutting and forwards, backwards, speech, the whole manipulation of magnetic tape completely took me over.
I see.
I mean, that became really my instrument, tape.
Right. His style owed to his instrument.
The work is informed by the medium. The medium is tape. And you know, one thing you do with tapes is you make loops.
Loops running simultaneously at different speeds, drifting apart and resynchronizing in ever-shifting patterns that explore combinatoriality and permutation. Like much systems music of the late 1960s and early 70s, more focused on complex textures instead of complex melodies. Here's an example. Jam, jam, jim, jom, jum is representative of Moore's style at this time, thoroughly imbued with the repetitive and combinatory logics of magnetic tape. The singers essentially intone an F suspended 4 chord for the entire piece, chanting phrases of 3 beats, 5, 7, 9, and 11. After 3,465 beats, or 21 minutes, the cycles resynchronize at their lowest common multiplier, and according to my undergrads who are mathematicians and explained how this works, and the piece concludes. Giggles highlight what is for me the distinctive charm of the recording. I hear them as the levity of a young artist who has hit on a musical style that is utterly fresh, but achieved without jumping through any of the expected hoops leading to the front edge of musical history. No lessons with the master, no university seminars, no Darmstadt lectures, no paying dues. All that Moore needed was a record collection, cool friends, 2 Revox decks, and a little inspiration. Rather than performing on a concert stage, Moore usually presented his work at film screenings, either with a stereo mixdown of the final soundtrack or by mixing loops live on the spot during projection. An agent heard Moore's music at one of these screenings and offered to help him get a record deal. That agent was Uwe Nettelbeck. This is another connection to something that Gail talked about. Routinely, large labels by the late 60s employed what was called the house freak. I'm trying to think about how marginal practices get pulled in, right? They're used, the house freak is used to go out there and be cool and basically find things that the suits wouldn't be able to find on their own. And so Uwe Nettelbeck was Polydor's house freak. Okay, the album that Anthony Moore eventually gave him in 1971 was positioned in a genre field undergoing a serious reshuffling. The agent had planned to take the demo to Deutsche Grammophon, the high-end classical imprint, but an executive in the company suggested instead that they release it on Polydor, their pop label. That suit had a point. Whatever the sonic similarities between this music and someone like Terry Riley, of Berkeley's own, there were still significant differences in their modes of production. The younger composer Moore had spent his entire musical life working directly with tape, off the page. Unlike the minimalist composers like Riley or Philip Glass or Steve Reich, Moore did not pursue formal training, and more importantly, he never conceptualized his practice in terms of traditional concert performance. A piece like Terry Riley's A Rainbow in Curved Air, which would be an obvious precedent for that clip that I played to you, a very famous record at that time, that was essentially made by Riley issuing a performance on his organ with tape delays. It was a live performance. Whereas Moore's music is never live, it's always discontinuous and built up out of the moment of live performance. I think that's a really important distinction, one that's based on practice. Moore moved on from Henry Cow in mid-1975, eventually releasing a classic pop album called Judy Get Down with Virgin Records in 1979. Virgin was Henry Cow's record label too. So he was long gone in 1978 when Henry Cow received substantial support from the Arts Council of Great Britain. They had been a relatively autonomous organization for a few years after they split ways with Virgin, guided by principles that lay somewhere between socialist and petty capitalist. But by 1977, their debts had begun to accumulate. Relief came first with a 9-date tour on the Contemporary Music Network. The network was an Arts Council scheme to subsidize the performance of contemporary music outside of London, where it was more difficult to attract a paying audience for new music. The reason this is significant is these gigs were really well paid. So a 9-date tour for a group like Henry Cow, especially in the UK where they couldn't get well-paying gigs, they got good paying gigs in France and Scandinavia, was really important to them. The other reason this tour was critically significant is that it got them in the system, as it were, of the Arts Council, so that later, after the tour, they would be awarded outright a grant of £7,000. So with all the money they made with their fees and travel on the tour, and then that later £7,000 grant, that's like £70,000 in today's money. So it was a really big deal. From pretty early on, this program distributed their funds between scored European-style art music and avant-garde jazz or free improvisation. Henry Cow was the first popular music act to receive funding of any kind from the Arts Council, and the details of their selection communicate something important about why, I think. The selection process for the Contemporary Music Network is somewhat convoluted. The details are important, so stick with me. The Arts Council had recently taken over stewardship of the British section of this thing called the International Society for Contemporary Music, or ISCM. And that body would put together an advisory panel every year to recommend ensembles for the Contemporary Music Network to the Arts Council, who would also solicit a list from its jazz subcommittee. The implication being that the ISCM did not do jazz, okay? Henry Cow was classified as jazz in the music panel's deliberations. These are notes from one of that panel's review of all the applications. Henry Cow were classified as jazz, but they were a nominee of the ISCM, not the jazz subcommittee. In other words, insofar as rock snuck into the Arts Council's music funding in the mid-1970s, it did so through Henry Cow's associations with high art contemporary music, live electronics and tape work, not through associations with any of the African diasporic musical forms that were otherwise defining the popular music landscape in the North Atlantic. Almost certainly the first rock band to receive Arts Council funding, Henry Cow were therefore also a socially conservative choice, removed as they were from these more overtly raced and racially marked vernacular musics. This makes a good moment to offer some general observations relevant to our topic today, before turning to Rosenfeld and the rest of this paper. Many in this audience will have already made it here. Even if the vernacular is informal, participatory, and so on, it cannot define a site, a set of practices, or a discourse that is distinct from, much less resistant to, the rebarbative race and gender binaries that we associate with more buttoned-up, specialized, and abstract fine art formations. This vernacular avant-garde looks a lot like the elite avant-garde. White masculinity saturates both formations. So while I would not want to discount the enormous significance of the shifting material and discursive conditions of the avant-garde in the last 70 years, I would want to remain attuned to the ways that they reproduce privilege and inequality in new forms. Mutatis mutandis, this is one of the points that Julia makes in the introduction to Frey. And yet, in its displacement and fracturing of the high-low opposition, I would contend that no matter the phenotype of its protagonists, the post-war vernacular avant-garde bears some special relationship to all of 20th century Black performance. I'm drawing on Fred Moten here. The operative terms of European avant-garde analysis, terms like autonomy, mass culture, critique, high and low, resistance, and progressivism, those terms were always inadequate, ill-fitting, and apposite for African-American performance traditions. If the vernacular practices of Black, brown, beige, and white avant-garde musicians in the last 70 years all appear to overflow and exceed the analytical containers we might already have for discussing avant-gardes, as I think they do, then any theoretical formulation resulting from the present conceptual definition would do well, therefore, to draw upon critical work that thinks through Blackness as the surplus of the production of the modern, even though it is doubtless imperative to think beyond the black-white binary. The white men on parade in the first part of this paper connects very easily to one of the animating questions in Marina Rosenfeld's early career. Given the social realities of the experimental music scene, how could she get women to come to her shows? Her solution was simple but consequential: recruit them to play her music. That's what she did for her first major piece, called the Shiraz Orchestra of 1993, which would be staged on numerous occasions in the decades since, the latest being 3 months ago in Chicago. Scored for 17 performers on 17 guitars and amplifiers, the piece directs its participants to manipulate nail polish bottles in a series of one-fisted choreographic actions: drop, hop, drone, slide, or scratch across the instrument. These gestures are often pinned to specific zones of the guitars, which are laid out horizontally for performance. Rosenfeld controls the temporal progression by segmenting time in the score in 1-minute chunks, which she represents with these little boxes on the score. So certain conditions of this piece are fixed. Those include the duration, which I think is 22 minutes, the number of performers and their spatial arrangement, and at least until recently, the uniform of white tuxedo shirts. The variables for these performances include the score, which usually Rosenfeld creates a new version of for every performance, as well as some of the execution of her notations. So I'll play you a quick recording of one staging of this piece. The rich sonic complexity of this music finds an analog in the Shiraz Orchestra's cultural politics. With their guitars spread out end to end in a long line, the orchestra stakes a claim on space with some ostentation, drawing its thin red line between performers and listeners with a string of nail polish bottles. As implements, the bottles also mediate the relationship between body and instrument, no touching. The guitar is not reclaimed so much as rendered strange. Rosenfeld writes, "As guitarists, we are cold instead of hot, in formation and in uniform, in fact, we're frosty, glassy, impermeable, opaque, sheer." Mixing registers of the ornamental and the regimental, Rosenfeld counters the hot rocker with a cool experimentalism, at the same time that she answers symphonic pretensions with a little Walgreens splash. When invited, Rosenfeld stages this piece with an all-woman ensemble that she assembles in the city of its exhibition. The social conditions of experimental music guarantee that many of these temporary participants will be amateurs. Each is responsible for procuring her own guitar and amplifier, a requirement that almost always transforms the casual social relations in underground art and music scenes, if only temporarily. What I mean to say is that this piece, staging it, usually involves girls borrowing guitars from boys, realistically. Once the musicians have those guitars, the instrumental language of the work is basic enough that it can be learned with just 2 or 3 workshops, usually led by the composer. The diminishment of instrumental technique, or de-skilling, which we've already heard about this afternoon, mines a rich vein in experimental music performance. Rosenfeld considers the recruitment, resourcing, and rehearsal periods to be rather more important than the performance itself. What I mean to say here is that the Shiraz Orchestra aims to intervene in the everyday, the quotidian, out there in regular social space, more so than it does in the formalized exhibition space of the gallery or the art museum. Like any uniform, the white shirts contribute to a sense of belonging, an esprit de corps that turns that ragtag collection of amateurs into a professional collective. It's a contingent formalization, but one with an afterlife. Former orchestras seem to turn to something more like alumni associations. The one I saw in December collaboratively authored a review and a narrative account of preparing the piece, and they published it online. Rosenfeld continued to work with these kinds of groups through the 1990s. Here's a piece from 1997 at Artist Space in New York called Ultramagnetic Ultra Amateur Orchestra. But it's by the 90s that Rosenfeld turns away from the guitar as a kind of symbol of musical history and ideology and goes to the record player instead, which opens a different set of genealogies for her through the 2000s. The performers here are important. The identity of the performers is important and relevant to my conclusion. They are in the back, the painter Laura Owens, the artist Julie Becker, sound artist Beth Coleman here in the foreground, and Sam Durant, who's, I think, over here somewhere. Artists, in other words. I'll come back to that in a minute, but to close off this discussion of Rosenfeld's work, I want to offer this general observation. These works are presented in fine art exhibition sites, and yet to me their pull in the vernacular nonetheless remains undeniable. In other words, if the early pop artists drew upon everyday visual reference but never really left the gallery, pieces like Shiraz Orchestra circulate into and out of vernacular and cultivated spaces in their temporal unfolding and the mechanics of contingent community formation. I think that this work is being heavily influenced by Suzanne Lacy, people like that. So if my Henry Cow examples demonstrate the striations inside of the vernacular, then these early Rosenfeld works caution against dismissing the gallery or the museum as necessarily antithetical to the amateur or the vernacular. So now to conclude, a few weeks ago I organized a large event on experimental music at Cornell. On the third day, while the widely traveled noise artist Spencer Ye gave a presentation on his work in the room next door, I was cleaning up the fajita bar that 1 hour prior had proven to be one of the event's great successes. 2 doctoral students in composition from my department scavenged their lunch while I put things away. I don't blame them. You guys know that an internationally recognized composer is giving a talk across the hall, right? My question met a blank stare. For me, this scene symbolizes something other than the entitled solipsism of the graduate composer or something. I think it's more about listeners and audiences. Spencer Ye probably couldn't care less about those graduate students, and their disinterest in him was plainly evident to me. Those students, of course, are training to become expert connoisseurs and to create works for their specialized audience of academic listeners. Ye, by contrast, seems to have found an audience of amateurs outside of those systems of accreditation that produce experts. But these are very particular amateurs who are usually experts in another domain: contemporary art, experimental film and video, or comics and zines. To return to my comparisons with the 18th century, which is where I started, I'm looking at an 18th century specialist right in front of me, I see some parallels with Emanuel Bach, who apparently preferred the company of literati to professional musicians. Musicologist Eugene Helm writes, Bach must have felt that Liebhaber such as these, intellectuals with little musical training, were an ideal audience for a music that combined easy accessibility with high standards of expression and craft, end quote. I'm struck by the similarities between this description of CPE Bach and the position of art-minded rock musicians in the 1970s, back to Henry Cow. As Bernard Gendron has explained, rock, punk, disco, and hip-hop emerge as sites of play and invention for artists across the disciplines in that decade, in the 70s. It's almost as if the band, the rock band, becomes a medium to work in, like sculpture, film, or drawing. Insert reference here to Judy Pena and the opening event on this day's activities. I would also, that is merely one of many connections between the musical performance that started and a lot of themes that come from the stuff that I study. Among them being the fact that John Cage wrote all of his early music for percussion for precisely the same reason. He didn't need trained musicians to perform it. He could get his friends together and play it in the living room or whatever. I also was reminded of, with that water bottle, that plastic water bottle hanging down, of Iggy Pop's drunken attempt to recreate Harry Partch's Cloud Chamber Orchestra, an instrument from the 40s and 50s that Iggy found out about from the back of an LP and tried to make it one for himself. I'm already over time, but I'm almost done. If the debt to Andy Warhol and the Velvet Underground is about artists working in rock, if the debt to Andy Warhol and the Velvet Underground is obvious here, there are other precursors. Recall the scene in D.A. Pennebaker's film Don't Look Back, when an impatient Bob Dylan interrupts the old-time folky Daryl Adams in a London hotel room, asking, "Are there any poets like Allen Ginsberg around here?" Stifled by an abstemious folk music culture, Dylan gazed laterally out to the new poets. If you've heard any of Ginsberg's musical performances, you'll already know that we're dealing with a Liebhaber and not a Kenner. The correspondence of this historical moment, the mid-60s to the mid-70s, with the transition to a so-called post-medium condition, seems like more than a coincidence. Such a condition puts pressure on any notion of expertise. Where do Kenner and Liebhaber fit in there? Accordingly, one area for future investigation in this project would be that of critical art practice or the post-studio pedagogy of someone like Michael Asher, who was Rosenfeld's teacher, by the way. As Chaz, is Chaz here? Chaz, okay, Chaz has already asked today, how do new kinds of Kenner continue to get produced after de-skilling would seem to crack the disciplinary foundation upon which expertise would previously have been built? And why does avant-garde music's significant involvement in the lateral exchange of the post-medium condition come in the vernacular register rather than in the cultivated? I will end with those questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So, first of all, thank you to Lauren for flawlessly executing pretty much every aspect of this event, as well as, of course, to Julia, not only for organizing and the invitation to speak and the lovely introduction, but also for many really lovely and generative conversations. What would it feel like to live in a world without amateurism? Jacques Rancière's The Ignorant Schoolmaster, 5 Lessons in Intellectual Emancipation, proposes a possible answer. Published in French in 1987, Rancière's book recounts the parable of Joseph Jacotot, a French revolutionary exiled to the Netherlands during the Bullerbyn Restoration. Jacotot spoke no Flemish and his students spoke no French. Despite this limitation, a remarkable thing happened. Even without training in the basics of French language, the students began to learn. Upon receiving their final essays on Fenelon's novel, Les Aventures de Télémaque, which they wrote in French, Jacotot discovered, quote, that the students left to themselves managed this difficult step as well as many French could have done. This remarkable result was produced by Jacotot and his students' mutual ignorance. Rather than a hierarchical transmission of knowledge from master to student, a structure Rancière describes as the explicative order, Jacotot approached his students as equals. His ignorance was an acknowledgement of both his own limitations and his students' intelligence, transforming his classroom into a space of radical egalitarianism. Fenelon's novel, Télémaque, played a crucial role in creating this space. As Rancière writes, quote, the intelligence of the book, that was also the thing in common, the egalitarian intellectual link between master and student. As translator Kristen Ross notes, this book could have been any book. The key to its emancipatory potential was neither form nor content, but the class's acknowledgement of its intelligence. There was only one rule in Jacotot's classroom, quote, he must be able to show in the book the materiality of everything he says. To do so was to extend the classroom's egalitarianism to the book itself, to respect its inherent intelligence much as student and teacher respected each other. The book then served as a mediator between distinct minds. Quote, "The materiality of the book keeps two minds at an equal distance, whereas explication is the annihilation of one mind by the other." I present Rancière's parable not as a theory to apply to the work under consideration, for to do so would be antithetical to his aims. Rather, I want to ask what an art history would look like if we were to begin from the radical presupposition that all makers, all people, regardless of culture or education, were equally intelligent. From this vantage, I could approach the work of Kai-Sik Wang without the qualifiers of artist or fashion designer. I wouldn't have to describe his oblique relationship to the term amateur, for such a term would not exist. I could take seriously his statement, quote, "My work is an attempt to recapture paradise lost. My vision of Eden inspires me to create what people might wear there," end quote, without embarrassment or apology. Wang wanted to create an egalitarian world akin to that described by Rancière and produced by Saputo. His life and work tell us something about the difficulties of implementing such a vision. His marvelous garments place us in the fray, as Julie Ryan-Wilson would have it, among hierarchies of taste whose boundaries remain policed by gendered and racialized notions of professionalism, labor, and intelligence. Using Wang's work as a guide, my talk today is an attempt to describe the historical and conceptual formulation of these boundaries and the challenges placed upon them by the ethos of the counterculture. This is, after all, the work of art historians. Yet throughout this paper, I also strive to take Rancière and Wang's lesson to heart. Explication is the work of shoring up the superiority of the self. It is a process of defensiveness and grief. To simply explain is not enough. One must respect the intelligence of the other, to think alongside them rather than about them. A sunflower blooms in a field of marigolds. Her cheekbones drink up the warmth like a 60s analog to Marlene Dietrich's silvery coolness. Her outstretched palm at once blocks the sun's harsh glare and absorbs its warmth, its tangible presence reflecting off the radiating rays of her glittering costume and golden headpiece. This same light nourishes the field around her, combining with water, air, and soil to create the lush carpet of blossoms to which she belongs. Kai-Sik Wang took this photograph of Merle Bulato in a costume of his own design in 1976. The photograph's title, I Ching Harvest, refers to the ancient Chinese divination text, also known as the Book of Changes. Harvest, too, is a process of change, clearing away the fruits of summer to make way for a new cycle of growth, governed by the rise and fall of the sun, the turning of the earth, distant songs evoked by the synesthetic warble of light over Bulato's sequin garment. Wang's costume replaces her skin with a glittering radial sheath whose meticulously seamed edges expand the boundaries of her body into the floral field. This still image this still photograph is an image of change, of transformation among numbers, symbols, words, and songs, animal, vegetable, and mineral. As I'm sure this audience at Berkeley is well aware, the title of this presentation, Extravagant Appropriation, plays on Derek Scott's foundational consideration of Black abjection. As Scott writes, with an abjection, quote, we may find that zone of the self or personhood exceeds into realms where we would not ordinarily perceive its presence, end quote. Wang's medium was extravagance rather than abjection. Within his skilled hands, Guatemalan textiles, Chinese opera costumes, Tibetan silk, and gold lame are combined into sculptural collages dense with textures, colors, and cultural signifiers that expand the bounded self in a structural, if not effective, parallel to Scott's formulation. Kai Wang was born in San Francisco in 1950. He died of AIDS-related leukemia in 1990 in the same city. He received his first sewing machine, a hand-me-down Kenmore, at the age of 14 from a soldier deployed to Vietnam. And as you can see, Wang made miraculous things. He made these things for many kinds of people: Salvador Dali, Tina Turner, and Getty, Danielle Steele, the flight attendants for the short-lived Freelandia airline, his sister-in-law, mother, and friends Paulette and Merle. This broad range speaks to Wang's extensive design training. He attended the Pacific Fashion Institute for 3 years, from ages 14 through 17, and in 1967 abandoned the Summer of Love to move to New York, where he worked for designers such as Adele Simpson. He had 2 ready-to-wear fashion lines, the short-lived Moontoux and Pitache Roque, which sold at upscale boutiques such as Henry Bendel. According to curator Melissa Leventon, Kaisik rarely employed assistants, preferring to fold, drape, cut, and sew his garments, letting, quote, the fabric tell him what to do. Wang then lies at an oblique angle to the category of amateur. Although he was professionally trained and enjoyed a fair degree of success, such as this 1972 Harper's Bazaar spread, his refusal of mass production placed him outside its market-driven mainstream, aligning him instead with the ideals of the 1970s craft revival. This association and his chosen medium of fashion design would seem to exclude him from the category of fine artist. Wang did not care about such boundaries. Beginning at age 17, he began to dress himself and his friends in clothes of his own making. They would strut around the city, dance at the Fillmore, and pose for photographs at San Francisco landmarks. He saw these photographs as the culmination of a design process that began with finding materials and ended when he arranged the garment on a body and embodied an environment. Both his brother, Kylie, and his friend, Wiley, described him to me as a living work of art. Indeed, as he told New York Magazine in 1978, quote, basically everything I do is the same. The idea is to get people together and get them in touch with the changing of the seasons. The clothes in the collection are merely functional versions of what we do in the theater, unquote. His ability to see theater, life, and clothing as part of a single spectrum of creative expression was indebted to San Francisco's countercultural ethos, as embodied by his friend, the Cockettes. This queer countercultural troupe transformed dressing and living into creative utopian acts. As Julia Ryan Wilson has written in her field-changing book, Fray, Art, Textiles, and Politics, quote, handmade outfits were part and parcel of a utopian vision in which smashing gender binaries seemed to them entirely possible. They wanted to devise their own discourse of drag, one whose iterative daily momentum might ignite a total transformation of the self, end quote. Wang held a similar attitude towards clothing's capacity to transform the self. Quote, clothing, he noted in the same 1978 interview, is a means of getting people attuned to the colors and seasons, getting them in touch with the earth. Yet unlike the Cockettes' safety-pinned, doily-affixed, thrift store sourced garments, Wang's garments were marvels of craftsmanship. Within his skilled hands, multiple textiles are combined into sculptural collages. And this use of ethnic textiles and motifs, as well as his New Age rhetoric, would seem aligned with the broader countercultural vogue for Eastern mysticism. The Orientalist valences of such a discourse is almost too obvious. White hippies turned to the undifferentiated East as a bastion of spirituality and purity. For Wang, however, these ethnic motifs were more than just vague references to otherness. They were his life. Like Martin Wang, whose luminous painting of the Chinese telephone exchange you see at left, Kaisik Wang grew up among the curled eaves and gilt wood of San Francisco Chinatown. He was the son of a well-to-do businessman who actually, Kylie told me, ran a lottery, and a successful and a glamorous Chinese businessman and a mother who identified with Elizabeth Taylor. Neighborhood stores sold bolts of imported silk, vintage clothing, and old opera costumes, which Wang used as source material for his extravagant creations. Chinatown also served as the inspiration for his favorite alter ego, the monkey. Dressed in a quilted metallic vest and pants of his own design and making, which he finished with furry white sleeves and a face of dramatic makeup, Wang performed the monkey role for both his friends in the counterculture as well as the Chinese community. Silent, he would approach people with quizzical gestures and sinuous simian movements, perhaps offering an outstretched paw before slinking away. The contorted pose of Wang's self-portrait reveals the character's debt to Peking opera's most beloved character, the Monkey King. This mythic troublemaker interrupts the opera's dramatic narrative with his lively movements and mischievous antics. While his hate-based friends described the character simply as a monkey, this specific character was immediately recognized by visitors to the Chinese Community Center, who grew up watching Peking and Cantonese opera in the neighborhood's theaters and movie houses. For Wang and the Chinese community then, the monkey was more than just the enigmatic signifier of Asiatic inscrutability, to quote Home King's formulation of Orientalism. For them, the materials, motifs, and characters of Chinatown instead overflowed with cultural and personal meaning. Perhaps this is why Wang combined Chinese sources with a broad range of ethnic textiles sourced from trips to Europe, Thailand, India, Africa, and South America. This dense array of ethnic signifiers figure the extravagant excesses of meaning contained in a single garment. In this one, for example, a spiral of red, gold, and green evoke both the cosmic structure of a mandala and a psychedelic vision. Wang had in fact sourced the cotton cloth from Africa in another garment featuring an identical pattern, modeled by the grotto in an Eden-esque garden and accessorized by a wide-brim hat whose radial shape transforms the teardrop pattern into a peacock's tail. This specific combination of Indian and African sources points to his engagement with the 20th century mystic Edgar Cayce, who wrote thousands of pages about the mythical lost continent of Atlantis, seen here in a late 19th century map by Ignatius Donnelly. According to Cayce, the Atlantean Empire once linked India, Africa, and the Americas, explaining what he understood as the commonality of ethnic cultures from distinct continents. As Wang recounted to author Douglas Boulis, quote, my major influence is the remembrance of El Dorado, Atlantis, and Lemuria, mythical lost lands that embodied the cultural syncretism of Wang's creations. Wang's deep engagement with ethnic textiles and theories of syncretism places his work somewhat at odds with the gender-bending strategies of the Cockats. The performance troupe deployed cultural signifiers to parody culture and identity, as in body productions such as Carlos over Shanghai, on the right. I take Wiley Wang, Kaisak's friend and a self-proclaimed member of Chinatown's 1970 Gaysian coterie, at his word when he told me that they found these productions hilarious rather than offensive. At the same time, we must take care not to collapse Wang's project into the Cockats. While he took something valuable from their flaunting of cultural hierarchies and taste, his work might also be placed in dialogues with artists such as Carlos Villa, who drew upon the cross-ethnic, anti-imperial energies of the Third World Liberation Front to advocate for cultural inclusivity. At the same time Wang was creating clothing, Villa was fashioning spectacular paint and feather capes, such as the one at right, in reference to his indigenous Filipino heritage. Wang, in fact, performed at the opening of Villa's iconic 1976 exhibition, Other Sources, unfurling bolts of saffron cloth across the San Francisco Art Institute's neoclassical facade. If we take Wang's invocation of Atlantis seriously, as I believe we should, his larger artistic project can be situated somewhere between Villa's search for cultural origins and the Cockats' utter disregard for essential identity. Rather than countercultural universalism or overt political activism, Wang's mix of ethnic motifs accord instead with David Palumbo's discussion of minoritarian cultures' refashioning of universalism. Quote, in the face of Eurocentric universal and various imperialist projects that underwrites, the minor has attempted to reassert its specific relation to the universal. It has written back its particular version of the universal against empire. End quote. Within Wang's hands, cultural syncretism was not a lost ideal, cultural syncretism was not a lost ideal. His search for Atlantis was an attempt to recover, and thus conjure into being, a prelapsarian moment before the fracturing of a global culture into discrete continents. Wang's project would reach its fullest expression with his Seven Rays series, which occupied a room at Salvador Dali's Teatro Museo in Figueres, Spain. And there are only 4 rays here. Those are in the collection of the Dion. He never finished one. There's a gold ray in a private collection, and then one he kind of remade into another garment. So after seeing Stephen Arnold's film Luminous Procurus and running into Wang at a Los Angeles hologram party, which was a thing in the 1970s, Dali invited them to Spain to open the Teatro Museo, which the elder artist described as a, quote, new, unsuspected, and hallucinatory world of surrealism. Each of the garments Wang made evoke a cosmic ray, referencing the established esoteric and theosophical tradition of associating colors with values. At once simple and elaborate, these shimmering cocoons are fashioned from Wang's signature panoply of ethnic textiles and shot through with warm and cool metallics. Wang signaled his deep understanding of theosophy through sly touches, such as the red garment's frontal flap, used to signal armor in Cantonese opera costumes, and according with the red ray's suggestion of power and will. The green ray's transformation of its wearer into an ear of corn embodies green's association with growth, while the bib of golden stripes and pointed hat invoke the hieratic splendor of Egyptian funerary artifacts. The sheer density of Wang's ethnic sources transforms signification, which arbitrarily assigns specific forms, such as a body, with specific meanings, such as gender ethnicity, into a polyphonic, multi-directional process. The headdress worn by Marbulato in a photograph by Wang taken at Antoni Gaudi's Parc Güell helps clarify this abstract assertion. Eusebi Güell, a Barcelona textile magnate, commissioned Gaudi to create this urban oasis in Barcelona. Natural stone, polished tile, and rusticated brick form iconographic references to local vegetation, Catholic iconography, and Catalan mystical traditions. The park's sinuous Art Nouveau curves unite this dense panoply into an organic whole, much as Wang united his textiles with the ruby and silver cloth of the red ray into a sculptural headpiece that transforms its wearer's hair into a helmet of lightning bolts. Here, Wang's thread functions a bit like Gaudi's cement, weaving distinct motifs into a single structure without sacrificing the individuality of each element. In works such as these, as well as Stephen Arnold's remarkable tableau of entwined bodies at the end of Luminous Procurus, syncretism is figured not as a transcendence of difference, but as a polymorphic process of recombination. Like the seven rays, which simultaneously embody values, astrological signs, planets, and gems, each ethnic motif is allowed to stand for multiple things at once. Wang's extraordinary craftsmanship is the key to this function, combining his thicket of signifiers into a coherent whole. His flawless seams at once uniting his diverse source material while also tracing their edges. Rather than orthodox surrealist rupture, which requires the shock of juxtaposition to denaturalize the sign's arbitrary binds, the luminous wholeness of Wang's garments overwhelm easy identification with any single race, ethnicity, gender, or category of matter. In Wong, Dali was likely reminded of designer Elsa Schiaparelli, for whom he first designed a version of a shocking pink couch of Mae West's pillowy lips seen in Arnold's photograph of Dali, Wong, Bulatto, and model Denise Bella. An early dress by Wong from 1968, featuring protruding tongues and a pair of hands encircling the neckline, reveals an obvious debt to Schiaparelli's play with illusion, flesh, and fabric, in works such as a pair of gloves adorned with candy red nails, or her famed trompe-l'oeil tear dress from the 1930s. For his part, Arnold considered himself the reincarnation of Jean Cocteau, another frequent Schiaparelli collaborator. Now, this fashionable surrealist milieu would seem to take us far afield from the Bay Area's countercultural craft ethos. Written about by Julia, of course, and encapsulated by Alexandra Jacopetti's 1974 fashion compendium, Native Funk and Flash. Subtitled An Emergent Folk Art, Jacopetti's championing of simple craft processes such as crochet and macrame as a native American art sits uneasily beside Wong's polished aesthetic and evasion of national boundaries. Despite this, Jacobetti included his work in her book, such as that vest on the right, which launched to fame when Balenciaga copied it, but that's another story. But to pause, I want to spend a moment and reveal the stakes of this unruly knot of surrealism, folk art, and fashion design, which I've kind of been weaving here, as well as Wong's role within them, which requires, if you will forgive me, a brief foray into the 1930s, when these terms were still in formation within the American lexicon. In 1936, the Museum of Modern Art opened Fantastic Art Dada Surrealism, arguably its most ambitious exhibition to date. This massive show included 711 objects, displaying painting and sculpture from the 15th through the 20th centuries, alongside advertisements, scientific instruments, architecture, film, animation cells, the work of children, folk art, and the work of the so-called insane. Legendary curator Alfred Barr wrote in the catalog and considered surrealism, quote, a serious affair, and for many it is more than an art movement. It is a philosophy, a way of life, a cause to which some of the most brilliant painters and poets of our age are giving themselves with consuming devotion, unquote. As I've argued in more detail elsewhere, Barr's understanding of surrealism as a universal impulse that reached beyond the realms of fine art was rooted in MoMA's earlier promotion of folk art in exhibitions such as Art of the Common Man. And to clarify, my use of folk art here is a historical rather than ontological category. In this 1932 show, curated by Holger Cahill, folk art was defined as objects made by hand without the aid of industrial technology. Drawing on the work of his teacher, Thorsten Veblen, Cahill championed objects such as weather vanes, ship figures, and paintings by 18th century itinerant artists as consolidating the, quote, sense and sentiment of a community. It was the suturing of the handmade in community that allowed Barr to place works of folk art alongside surrealist experiments in Fantastic Art Dada and Surrealism. Within folk art and surrealism, amateurism held the key to universality. Following a familiar primitivizing logic, Barr turned the artistic production of those ostensibly unencumbered by the constraints of modern society, children, folk artists, the insane, to frame surrealism as an essential element of human nature rather than a high avant-garde artistic procedure. In works such as automatic drawings, winking porcelain cats, or spoons found in prison cells, the unconscious expression promoted by the surrealists supplanted moribund categories of skill or education, allowing Barr to locate artistic value at a capacious range of culture. The museum's attempted imbrication of folk art, surrealism, and amateurism became the subject of critic Emily Genauer's notorious screed against MoMA, The Fur-Lined Museum, published in Harper's Magazine in 1944. As its title suggests, Genauer pinpoints fantastic art dada surrealism as the origin of MoMA's decline, paving the way for what she described as, quote, stunts like the display of a tinsel bedecked Shishan chair or the doodlings of inmates of insane asylums or the pathetic efforts of frustrated amateurs. Genauer's invocation of Joe Maloney's tinsel-bedecked shoeshine stand alongside Murray Oppenheim's titular fur-lined teacup suggests the elision of folk art and surrealism in the mind of the museum's critics. Both validated the work of amateurs, threatening the sanctity and labor of professional artists. Indeed, for Genauer, MoMA's focus on these works siphoned away support from real artists. Quote, while serious professional artists fight for the recognition that life means to them, the modern fiddles away its resources, building a precious cult around amateurism, end quote. This brief historical exegesis clarifies the conceptual commonality between surrealism and the anti-consumerist ethos embodied by native flash and funk. Surrealism's promotion of unconscious expression and folk art's emphasis on handmade anti-industrial work broadened the field of artistic production to include so-called amateurs. Despite its combative tone, Genauer's article did point out the impossibility of sustaining fully this broadened perspective. A radically leveled field of culture might be an ideal, but time, money, attention, and space are always limited. Even Rancière acknowledged this problem, using the quality of attention as a means of distinction. For a figure like Wang, who defied classification, the toll was high. His practice flouted conventional boundaries among media and hierarchies of taste, diluting his impact across fields. By spreading his practice across performance, fashion, art, and between amateurism and professionalism, Chinatown, and the counterculture, he never received wide prominence in any one. And by way of conclusion, I'd like to briefly place Wang's work in dialogue with the contemporaneous movement happening just across the bay. In 1974, the same year Wang went to Spain, Sun Ra released Space is the Place. Clad in a dramatic saffron cape and glimmering Egyptian headpiece, Sun Ra traverses the wilds of Oakland in search of black outer space colonists. Like Wang, Sun Ra's aesthetic is at once antediluvian and futuristic, speaking to his position between the utopian ideals of the counterculture and the radicalism of the Black Panthers, between the recovery of an impossible past and the impossible dream of a utopian future. Also in 1974, the funk singer Betty Davis released her second studio album, They Say I'm Different. Set against an assertive background of funky grooves and thumping percussion, Davis announces her sexual appetite in seductive curls and guttural howls. At once raw and sophisticated, Davis's music finds a visual corollary in her album cover, which features the singer clad in a custom Kaisik Wang design. Using the same red and silver striped cloth used to fashion the red ray, Wang's garment transforms Davis into a futuristic Egyptian goddess, complete with a pyramid at her motif at the center of her solar plexus. I think Wang once stated, the body should be a jewel, a radiant beauty. The light that radiates from Davis's garment, the luminosity of Wang's silver stripes and sequins, these are moments of expansion beyond the confines of the body, which originate not in some ethereal elsewhere, but from the cloth itself. In both Wang and Afrofuturism, we find the minoritarian dream of a world that both preserves and unites difference, a world in which the categories of gender, ethnicity, and culture do not apply. An impossible world materialized in fabric. Thank you.
All right, wow.
So myself, like the other respondents at this panel, were not able to preview the papers and the images and the text beforehand. So literally trying to transcribe notes on the fly and come up with an amazing kind of, I guess, entryway for a conversation here. First of all, thank you so much. That was really wonderful from the perspectives of your fields. And in regards to the idea of the amateurism in the arts, I think I just wanted to kind of set the tone. So I act as an art professor in an institution in which we're all participating in as we decide to kind of pick apart the idea of the things we find outside of the institution. And I think that's really interesting because, you know, we're self-conscious about it and we're kind of holding it up as this kind of thing that is inside and outside at the same time. What I noticed is that the different artists that were spotlighted had a kind of interaction at some point with institutions, you know, with either art training or music training, and then for various reasons decided to kind of make a break. And so I guess I wanted to talk about or identify what Benjamin brought up, which was the kind of three-tiered spaces of the market, the state, and the academy, as these spheres in which the avant-garde is potentially kind of vacillating through. And then thinking also about, I guess that blurred, in the cases of the papers delivered, the interesting potential interchangeability or even friction between the term amateur and avant-garde. Because for me, as an art professor, if I teach about the avant-garde, it's always this notion of it's an avant-garde with the idea that at some point it wants to be potentially enveloped by the institution. You know, so versus, I'm not sure if someone was considered themselves an amateur, if they would actually want to, you know, formally enter the system. So I thought that was interesting. So again, the idea of this inside out, and if it's at all possible to escape the institution, because in a way, some of the things that it looked like Kai-Sek Wong was fighting against too, where Marcy, you identified that he never really got traction because, for better or for worse, the divides between fashion, art, and music or performance were so highly set up, and those are because of the institution, I can imagine. So so to explode those boundaries would mean this potential ability to not have to relate to it anymore, to the standards, whatever those might be. So I guess to phrase a question around that, maybe we can just start with the idea of the amateur and the avant-garde. And if you see a kind of difference or synchronicity between how you would utilize those. Because personally, actually, if I work with art students or craftspeople, they do not want to, the word amateur is something that is highly suspect. Like they don't like that word at all, even though I think because it means that you are not aspiring somehow, you know, or so the idea of the art being at the highest and that somehow they're always trying to get to that state. Anyway, I'd love to hear.
I would just say, well, thank you for that. I think that in the case of Henry Cow, who I'm just a little, I can work with Henry Cow a little bit more easily than I can work with Marina right now, because Marina's a new research topic, so I'll probably default to Henry Cow. Yeah, like I think about them in relation to punk, for example, which comes out of nowhere in the second half in June 1976. Well, they are on tour. They come back to England in December or something, and they suddenly realize that London has changed. They've been on the continent. That there's this new energy, there's a new politics, there's a new politics of personal style and presentation, there are new venues for presenting the music, where this band literally cannot fit on the stage with their PA. They are too big to fit in punk clubs. There are all these like reasons why suddenly they're faced with a new material situation. But the one that pertains directly to the point that you raise is the one about virtuosity and anti-virtuosity in punk. Henry Cow never had a discourse of amateurism with their instruments. They were trying to become, I think of their relation, let's say, to accreditation as one of coming in from the outside that seems particular to the 1960s and after. I don't know if I would equate that with amateurism, as perhaps I did in that paper, but as I'm kind of talking it out now, they in fact were highly invested in instrumental skill, developing it, deconstructing it with forcing themselves to work with new instruments in order to kind of shake up their patterns and stuff like that. So in that sense, I don't see them partaking in that kind of expectation that avant-gardes break out of formalized and established instrumental or formal techniques.
Great. Thank you for the question. I mean, first of all, in terms of institutions, I would say that, of course, everyone's always implicated. You know, there's this discourse around, for example, I'm sure many of you saw the Souls Going Deep Foundation's exhibition at the De Young. And I mean, that presents, I think, a crucial case study. You know, these artists supposedly were just, you know, quote unquote discovered, like making fishing lures and things. But then, you know, their lives were shaped by Jim Crow. And then there was this influx of white collectors who were able to, who, you know, gave them things like paint and brought them into the fine art realm. And so I think that you know, it's inescapable. And I think that inescapability is, I guess, leads me to my answer to this question about the relationship between amateurism and avant-gardism. You quoted Fred Moten, and I've been really inspired by something he said recently in a talk I saw him give, which is, why are we always trying to name our way out of the problem? It's like, we're just like looking for the right term, and if we get the right term, like everything will be fixed. And I think the introduction of my piece with the Rancière was very much a kind of self-reflexive move about thinking about the limitations of academic discourse in terms of discussing this material, you know, and even just the kind of limits of explication and the power relations that are embedded in that very act. And so what I would say is that I'm trying, I think I've just been trying to adhere to, I don't know, in my writing recently, a kind of rhetoric of specificity as opposed to just a kind of genealogy of categories for that reason.
I would just also want to, on the question of naming, I mean, that's a good line from Fred. What was it, name your way out of the problem? I do think there is something to be said, though, for trying to pull out and accurately describe a concept that historical materials seem to be kind of kicking up at you, that you don't have concepts to describe. That's how I think about a lot of my work. And I'm thinking in particular of the David James book on minor cinema. What's the name of that book? Most Typical Avant-Garde. Where he explains, I want a term called minor cinema, not to finish a conversation, but to gather some things that might otherwise not get gathered because they present a number of really interesting problems of analysis, you know, that would be answered and extended in many different ways, but yeah.
I mean, I completely agree with that, and in relation to that, I think that what terms do, and I mean, this is like the term of folk art, which is gathering all of these kind of diverse practices under a single heading. It allows for legibility and circulation, so it's like about like fungibility, right? And so it allows it to circulate more broadly. And so again, I just think a lot of what I've been thinking about is like how one kind of lives within that system and works and survives it, and instead of trying to transcend it, like kind of use its materials.
I'm sorry? Oh, okay. All right, let's open it up to questions.
Hi. I had a question for Marcy about Kaisek specifically, and kind of just the general state of like art in San Francisco at the time, because it comes at like a really like special and profound time in which a lot of different movements in San Francisco are quite prominent and giving birth to a lot of figures who now considered quite canonical. And like also a lot of like theater, like Beach Like a Babylon, like 1974. Also like Museum of Conceptual Art. There are all these different iterations of kind of like creative output that kind of have a commonality of like an earnest belief in like what art can do. And I was just kind of wondering, considering that and like kind of like camp as both really, again, like earnestly in favor of like that power, but also quite aware of its limitations, and how it holds those two things at once. Kind of like, how do we understand amateurism as that gesture of kind of like earnest love, but also kind of like understanding the limitations of the professionalized practice, and how that kind of like manifests in really like the impossibility, but also like the only possibility of an intensely like specific individualism that also has to do with like something that's like incredibly universally human.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So what I would say is, I mean, first of all, to the Bay Area scene, yes, I had an entire section on Stephen Arnold, like here, and that just ended up being cut, which, you know, thanks to the heroic efforts of the Pacific Film Archive, I actually saw for the first time. You know, and Carlos Villa was a huge fan of Bruce Nauman and Bruce Conner, and so there's all of these. Certainly, there are all of these things circulating, and I'm really actually interested in how. Specifically, I think in the next, this is my first pass at a lot of this material, so I think in the next iteration, I think I'd bring out more of the Carlos Villa, other sources, this kind of Bay Area, kind of multiculturalism that isn't the kind of familiar 1990s multiculturalism that we know, but is actually grounded in an anti-colonial struggle. So that's kind of one vector to the question. And in terms of what you're talking about, in terms of this, both utopianism and individuality and like those things coexisting each other, all I'd say is yes, that's a description of the state that kind of impossible state that I was trying to sketch out, where like, you know, you live in San Francisco Chinatown, like you are, you know, I talked with Kylie for like 3 hours, and he was like, yeah, we totally knew we were discriminated against, you know, by the housing discrimination laws. Like all of our friends were like in this quarter, and the only way that discourse around San Francisco Chinatown has been discussed is in terms of like a self-orientalizing with Martin Wong, which is not what was going on. You know, and so I think that there is, and I've talked with members of the Caucats actually, and you know, discourses of race are very touchy there. And so I think that, you know, that was just the kind of lived experience of these, like, you know, they call themselves Gaysians, like people like Bernice Spang, Kaisek, Wiley Wong, Red Gallery in San Francisco, who are kind of traversing between these two communities, which are really adjacent to each other. I mean, you know, like the Caucats like first premiered in, it's always called the Palace, it was the Pagoda Palace Theater, it shows Cantonese opera films. So it's like those histories are actually really intertwined just in like the daily iterations of their lives.
Oh, thank you. Do I have to do something? Okay, thank you. I was only here for the lecture on Wong. Sorry to say, but I really enjoyed it. One thing I wanted to ask you was, when you were describing early on in the lecture the photograph of the outfit of the very orange and red when you were describing it, were those your words?
The orange and red, like silver.
Yeah, you were finding.
Yeah.
So I found that really interesting because I enjoyed the lecture and it wasn't like devoid of feeling at all, but there was this like total explosion of words and creative feeling within your lecture that came from you. And I just found it interesting because it was like some of the subject who we eventually found out you were very in love with rubbed off on you, and it to me it just said a lot about your artisticness within this greater lecture about artisticness. It reminded me of this thing that Joseph Beuys said, where everyone is an artist, and it's never like sure to me whether you're saying everybody's life is an artist or everybody could be an artist. But I just saw something there. That's what I wanted to say, because it was really quite a poem. I'm sorry, I'm doing a really bad job with this.
I'm very appreciative of that question and those comments. So what I would say is, so I think a lot about countertransference, so that's one thing. And then the other thing I would say is that I think that it was really this Rancière provocation where he actually talks about poetry, and there's a section, and if I had more time I'd probably go into it, I just wanted to introduce it for the purposes of the lecture, where he's like, everybody's a painter. And that's actually a very serious proposition for him, which is about this proposition of equal intelligence, of egalitarianism, and the motivation behind that being one of generosity as opposed to one of pride and a kind of putting up of boundaries. And so, and he talks about poetry as a kind of attempts to put into words the inexpressible. And I think that, maybe that moment is also this moment of my own acknowledgement of my limitations. It's not for me like this virtuosic act, it's an acknowledgement that I will never touch that garment on screen, and so all I can try to do is think alongside it. So that's what I would say. Well,
it was really nice. And just one other thing, at the risk of beating a dead horse with this amateur avant-garde business, I think words are so impossible. Avant-garde's a little easier because it's almost in quotes, it's in so many publications, so many people have talked about it in a similar way. But still, it's slippery. But amateur, oh my God, that's just all over the place. You have amateurs who want to become professionals. You have amateurs who don't make money who want to become professionals to make money. That's the word professional. You have amateurs who don't even know they're amateurs. It's a wonderful thing. I'm not saying, oh darn, we can never solve this problem, or it's not worth looking at it, but it's good to, like when I'm in these situations, I always have to keep this in mind. These words are just, they're just anybody's guess, Thanks.
Thank you both for extraordinary papers where I learned so much. And this is a question for Benjamin. I am completely ignorant about music in general, and so I preface my question with that. And I was wondering if you could talk about race in relationship to the scene and the moment that you historicized for us, right? Because you did kind of frame it around gender to a certain extent, when in the move from so there's these white boys and so on. To get to the women, you kind of passed through very quickly a African-American relationship to amateurism in music. And so I was wondering if you could go more towards it, because I think the reason it caught my attention really was because there's a couple moments in your presentation where there were no images, and it usually had to do more with moments where you were going into yourself as opposed to talking about an object, but that was one of the moments where there are no images. And so I was like, where are they? So just out of my own ignorance, if you could share some of that.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. On the general subject of race, in the UK in the late 1960s, in rock circles or, okay. Well, one way to talk about it, I think, maybe in relation to some of the terms that I think we're working with today, would be a lot of my protagonists as audience members, that is, as fans, which I was trying to get at as this kind of circulation between fandom and then the production, okay? So, and I was reminded of during, at the end of Marcy's paper, because Chris Cutler was a real aficionado of Sun Ra, and he eventually published in 1984 probably the first extended, serious scholarly book chapter on Sun Ra in his book File Under Popular. But even during Henry Cow days, he was religiously devoted to Sun Ra. And didn't know Sun Ra. Didn't see Sun Ra when Sun Ra came to the UK, to Europe for the first time in 1971. I don't know why Chris didn't go. I know I asked him that, but I kind of can't summon the detail right now. Or Tim Hodgkinson, co-founder of the group, who framed his musical identity, not being a trained composer of any sort, framed that musical identity through his consumption practices. And that was the consumption of Black Avant-Garde out of New York, Blue Note and Impulse records, which were imported to London, to a specific shop in North London. His older sister played him John Coltrane's Africa Brass in 1962. It was a very important moment for Hodgkinson. He began collecting those records. That settles them, and there are other examples. I could keep going. Of some of the other early members. That settles them to me, very cleanly into a tradition that's been widely analyzed of white record aficionados devoted to cataloging the work of their Black idols. It's race discourse, the Black-white relationship is different in the UK than it is here, and
because the Caribbean is so present there.
That's one reason. Yeah, the other reason is that kind of free improvised music in London at that time would be just as strongly identified with South Africa, because a group of South Africans, Louis Moholo and Dudu Pakwana and Mongezi Feza, who played on a Henry Cow record in 1975, they kind of flood the scene in a group called the Blue Notes in the late 60s. So they're around, but the greats, the titans, the idols, they're the Black Americans who come through on tour now and then. They're not around, they aren't colleagues to play with. Now, sonically, whether visually and they're there physically in place as colleagues or interlocutors is one thing, but sonically, African American tropes are everywhere in their music. That's because they loved the music, and that was one of the things they tried to emulate. They also tried to emulate Stockhausen and Edgar Perez and John Cage a little bit. So yeah, I mean, race tells a story in sound different than it does visually in that group. I would be inclined to describe the tape loop not necessarily as a technical operation, but as another means to repetition and difference that is also a signal trope of African American aesthetics, as I do in the book. I'll just say real quickly, this is a long answer. With Marina Rosenfeld, I kind of signaled this in one of my too numerous ad-libs, which is that the switch from the guitar to the turntable puts her back to the Caribbean, to sound system culture and versioning, which essentially is, that is the genealogy that she's working through after around the year 2000. So she's making her own sound systems as installation pieces, in around 2010. She's collaborating with Warrior Queen, who's a dance hall MC, and there's a more kind of expressly articulated relationship to Black musical production and vernacular there that isn't there with the white indie guitar world, that I try to capture with that Mike Watt image. It sort of said everything that I wanted to say, that image. So it's the beginning of an answer. That's a big topic.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you both so much, and thank you also to Stephanie for your response. I have a question. Well, first of all, thank you, Ben, for this phrase about striations inside the vernacular, which I thought was really a helpful way to think about parsing some of the distinctions within distinction that I feel like are at stake in our conversations today. And I'm interested in how both of you are thinking about the problem of of art as an institution, art history as an institution, not only though in its maybe rapacious or consuming qualities, which it definitely, I mean, I think that we're often very troubled by the way that perhaps what we might call the minor can be absorbed within these institutional spaces. But I think for both of your narratives, for Kai-Sik Wang or then for the people that you're talking about, both in the 70s moment and then in the 90s and 2000s, the art institution as a space for an alternative sense of a creation of an audience, or some sense that actually the art space is interestingly providing some different kind of apparatus for viewership and for listening. And I'm just kind of curious to hear a little bit more of a generous vision about how art and art history, art as a set of institutions, or art history as a discipline, might in fact be porous enough to accommodate all of these different kind of registers of making.
So thank you, Julia. I mean, that's a great question, and I worked in many art institutions, so I don't think they're just evil. but what I would say is that that's kind of why I introduced the MoMA example. In addition to that was the only way I could think through this surrealism craft thing. But in that case, it's this moment in the 1930s. I argued this elsewhere, where MoMA is founded like a couple of months after the great stock market crash. So what do you do when there's this new populist imperative, and which is very much what I think the kind of interest, the very early interest in folk art and surrealism have to do with. And I think it's not necessarily that show, Fantastic Art Dot and Surrealism, is this kind of rapacious thing. I think it actually is capacious, actually, in how much it creates. But what's really interesting is, and this is something maybe that ties to Ben's talk, is that the way Bard chose things in these various categories was he was still making distinctions. So he was looking for the best work of children's art. He wrote this school teacher in Michigan. He's I saw this illustrated somewhere. I think it's so great. It's the one I showed with the little people being attacked by arrows. And he was yeah, I'm really interested in this. And so he actually was making these distinctions within categories while he was looking across a broad array of categories. But what I think the institution very materially figures is that there are always limitations to capaciousness. You have to, I think that we all know the problems with taste and hierarchies of taste and value, but at the same time, we literally can't talk about everything or look at everything. We're always making those cuts somewhere. And so I think that it was more about kind of setting up that tension there, as opposed to being and realizing that this is a process that happens over and over and over again. So.
I would just say, real quick, I mean, I work on experimental music. That history is essentially defined by musicians addressing an audience in an art gallery. I mean, so many moments, like John Cage's big 25th year retrospective concert in 1958 is funded by Jasper Johns, Robert Rauschenberg. They give him the money to rent the hall. Minimalism, I mean, it's so many things. What that's, in a way, to come back to that thing with C.P.E. Bach. It was funny because there was a C.P.E. Bach scholar sitting right here during my talk, but I think he had to go back and teach his class. That thing about Bach really being interested in experts, amateurs in music who are experts in another medium or discipline, that really helped me to, the yellow note card that came off of from the year 2004, it really helped me figure something out, I think, about especially how Rosenfeld is addressing an audience and who the audience is. They're not necessarily people born and raised from music, with some exceptions. And in a sense, there's a certain exchange happening in practice there by artist practitioners that is the mirror inversion of what is happening today in among theorist historians, which is a kind of interdisciplinary exchange across vocabularies or trainings or zones of expertise. The other thing but say those other guys, Henry Cow, the institution mediating them and their audience was the record label. It was not the gallery, it was the record label. That's one of the new problematics that is highlighted with a turn to the vernacular, I have realized. They don't care about the art institution, capital A, capital I. They care about this very powerful thing that sits between them and maybe a lot of people. And they really wanted their music to not be for a small group of people. It was a minority taste, trust me. But they felt like, they had talked about and wrote about this a lot. They needed to interface with the record label somehow because it unlocked an audience for them. A big audience, bigger than avant-garde free improvisation or something. So they were willing to trade off and use that institution very self-consciously. This kind of leads to a question. I don't know if do we have time for one more? Because I want to ask Marcy a question about audiences, actually. Just like, I think it's interesting. This is not the first time it's come up, but how artists are imagining audiences. And do you have a sense of who did Wong think his audience was? I mean, was it fellow practitioners in other disciplines like Betty Davis? Was it regular people? I mean, I think that's actually a very important question for assessing this issue of amateur versus professional. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So there are very, very few interviews, archival sources, things like that, and so it's hard to say entirely, except that he was a couturier. He was like dressing like San Francisco's elite, and was actually, I think, also, and this is something I want to look into later, is like, he was in LA for a reason. He was definitely also somehow connected, I think probably through Stephen Arnold, to a kind of Hollywood crowd as well, which is how he began designing for celebrities and things like that. And so I think that what you describe, which is the kind of capaciousness of maybe mass distribution for a wide audience, which he was always denying, versus the kind of handcrafted couture ideals that he was actually embodying in his own work. Like he was somewhere in the middle, and I think pulled constantly between that. And I would also say, like, he was designing for himself and for his mom. Like, his mom was his best friend, and he was just, dressing all of his friends. And so I think that he was kind of skipping between, like, this kind of coterie, performance coterie of the counterculture, himself, and a kind of larger audience.
I'm just curious. Were you asking that question because you're curious about, like, would professionalization have satisfied him, in the sense of, like, would then that have taken him out of the tier of amateur if?
Oh yeah, well, I don't know about that. I mean, I'm glad that you went right to the bit about his resistance to mass production. Because I thought that was really striking, and I thought that's an interesting way to think about amateurism, because the mass-produced commodified space is the abject space in musical systems of value, right? In order to get up, you need to deny that you are part of that space. That doesn't mean, I mean, that's going back to the striations, you know, about audience. For Henry Cow, Tim Hodgkinson did this interview in like 1976 or 77, something like that, where this French journalist asked him, do you know about Brian Eno's Obscure Records, a record label? It was an imprint of Island, a massive British label. But they published like John Cage pieces performed by Robert Wyatt, and they put out like music for airports and kind of crossover records. And Hodgkinson said, no, we're not interested in that. We don't want that kind of label. We're a rock band, and rock music is for everybody. Now that is plainly untrue. Rock music is not for everybody, and especially in 1976 or 77, that is not, everybody is not the market of rock. It's a very restricted kind of demographic and stuff. But I mean, I think that for me is important in the way that it indicates his imagination of who he's addressing, you know? Like the mass is important to them.
And
you know?
I think we actually have a lot to talk about in terms of discourses of folk as well, because I mean that's precisely where this discourse of folk is coming out of. It's coming out of like really hardcore leftist theory taught by Thorstein Veblen at New School, you know. And so that ethos has always been present. But I think we also want to. I think you're situating it historically, obviously, but I'm also really wary of this. As I'm sure many people have talked about today, with this imputation of amateurism with authenticity, and the ways, I mean, that's so easily figured as a kind of nationalism, native funk and flash, you know, things like that. And so so I think that it's constantly kind of striking this balance, you know, or depending on, it takes on all of these valences depending on the particular cultural moment. I mean, that's why I think the 30s and 60s are so interesting. It's like they're both moments of this kind of opening, they're both moments of folk revival, and this desire for authenticity that's sometimes figured through universality, but sometimes there's a recourse to a kind of authentic soil, like back to land. And actually those two things run on very parallel tracks. And so I'm really interested in that comment. Sorry, I think there's a question.
Yes, I think insert this idea that Isaac Wong was working at the very top of the tier of very active art-to-wear designers in this period. So there was a sense of couture with no idea that there was any Amateurism in it, rather than exclusive elitism.
Exactly.
So.
No, I think that's absolutely right. I didn't talk about art-to-wear, but yeah, no, I mean, he was not an amateur designer, like he was trained, you know, and I think that, but what's interesting is what happens, you know, when he goes into something like the Coquettes, which very much is this amateur, like how does he fit within that? And how does the fashion design then kind of not prevent him because of these, I think, ideals of authenticity and purity from actually going into the fine arts? So I think that it was precisely his kind of position among all of these categories that allows us to kind of have an oblique angle or raking light across them. Right?
Well, I'm going to conclude by thanking you, and I'm going to transition into introducing. So thank you. Let's have a round. Sorry. But there was a question raised earlier this morning during a panel that had to do largely with architecture. A question from someone who said, well, why aren't we hearing really more from the amateur makers themselves, and we should be doing ethnographies and this and the other, and I had a comment back in response, but what I should have done, and Marcy's beautiful talk reminded me, was launch a vigorous defense of formal analysis as a way to understand the process of making, and that we do not need recourse to ethnography in order to understand how objects are made. So she's not here to hear that snappy retort, but I went about it hours later. So we are going to, after this introduction, we're going to move to the, what is that called? Since I'm not an architectural historian, I don't know the word, but it's the walkway right outside. It's covered. It's called a portico. What's those? There we go. All right. So it's a student fashion show that is hosted by Derek Durin and organized by the student group FAST, or Fashion and Street Trends. And I'll just introduce Derek quickly, which is that he's going to be emceeing. He's a senior transfer student at Berkeley, completing a double major in media and American studies. They have dedicated much of their extracurricular time to social justice education and advocacy through their experiences as Multicultural Awareness Chair and as Curator for Multi, the inaugural showcase for students of color at UC Santa Barbara. Derek currently serves as Development Assistant and Honorary Student Committee Member at the Berkeley Art Museum, and they are the Arts and Design Student Committee Chair. And let me just say that Derek and FAST have worked in concert with the Arts Research Center and our DIY couture sewing and garment making workshops, which were hosted by Angie Wilson, a local artist who's here today. And they have worked really hard to organize not just the garments and the outfits, some of them have organized looks, meaning they have taken outfits from that they did not make, but they have, the style is produced by them. But also the models, hair and makeup, she does all music, commentary, the entire thing has been organized by them. I have not seen 1 second of it, so it will be very new to me as it will be to you. So let us go to the portico and we will, yeah, bring your stuff, and then there'll be a reception